Paris-Belleville.
Paris-Belleville.
Belleville.
Architecture.
Belleville.
Paris-Belleville.
Belleville.
École nationale supérieure d'architecture.
École nationale supérieure d'architecture Paris-Belleville.
Belleville.
Merci d'être venus si nombreux pour cette deuxième session de nos causeries de novembre que nous devons largement pour la logistique, comme je le rappelle à chaque fois, mais réellement c'est important, à la générosité de la Fondation STO et de sa sympathique équipe. Nous avons choisi, vous vous en souvenez sans doute, ceux qui étaient là la semaine dernière, de dédier ce petit mini-cycle à cette question vaste des écologies au pluriel et de la manière dont nous pourrions essayer d'en définir quelques biais à travers la pratique de différents collectifs, agences ou individus qui, chacun à leur manière, essaient d'en donner presque une définition. Donc, il semblait assez naturel, je dirais presque, d'inviter H-Architectes ce soir, ce quatuor de jeunes, enfin relativement jeunes, architectes barcelonais, qui, me semble-t-il, développent depuis quelques années une manière assez magnifique d'intégrer tout ce qui est dispositif climatique dans les bâtiments qu'ils traitent, que ce soit des bâtiments neufs, des bâtiments réhabilités, des grands, des petits, des bâtiments publics, des maisons privées. Alors, est-ce que le mot d'intégrer est juste? Sans doute pas, parce que vous allez voir, quand on voit ces projets, on a l'impression que c'est de ces questions-là que naît même l'architecture, l'espace, la construction, même la pensée du chantier, la pensée matérielle, dont témoigne ce titre. Et ce travail a été, personnellement, je le connais surtout par les publications, vous sans doute aussi peut-être. C'est un travail qui a été beaucoup publié par la florissante industrie de l'édition en Espagne, notamment dans El Croquis, dans un numéro spécial d'Architectura Viva de 2017, que je vous recommande, je pense qu'on a tout ça à la bibliothèque, mais qui reste relativement méconnu en France. Donc voilà, ce soir nous accueillons Josep, qui est l'un des 4 architectes du groupe, que nous remercions vraiment beaucoup d'avoir fait le voyage jusqu'à nous. Thank you for coming to us. La conférence sera en anglais, les questions aussi, mais voilà, si vous avez besoin, on peut traduire, on s'arrangera. Sans plus tarder, je lui laisse la parole. Josep Ricart, merci beaucoup d'être venu jusqu'à nous.
Thank you, François. Thank you for the invitation. In general, I will try to don't explain complete projects. I will try to explain certain ideas, certain values of the office, and try to explain these values through parts of the project. I think that is not a good idea in terms of lectures. Try to explain the projects as smart ideas, because a project is such a complex process that sometimes we try to lie our students about that is an incredible and smart idea that you can draw in a pumpkin or something like that. I think that is far more serious, and then it's we don't try never to explain our projects as a whole process, just as a part of the project, as an example of an idea. In this line, I begin with this picture. I've used this thousands of times because it's a picture to explain a little bit the biography of our office. We are 4 partners. I suppose that everybody can imagine how difficult it is to work together, 4 people, 4 designers, and in our case it's only possible based in 2 basic ideas. One, don't put over the table, don't put in discussion any personal desire. It's not the only way to do architecture, I know, but to work as a team is impossible to try to convince the people in front of you about your personal desires. Our clear idea is that it's only possible to talk about objective, clear concepts that can be discussed, that can be argued. In this line, one of the common places that during the 20 years of the office has been always there is our interest for the vernacular, for the popular construction, like in the right side of the picture. This is just an example. It's not the kind of vernacular that we have in our surroundings and our streets in Barcelona, in the small villages that we live in the surroundings of Barcelona. But because we are for the vernacular, the popular, it means, and it meant in the beginning, that kind of anonymous stuff that's easy to be shared between four peoples, that kind of non-personal desires that it's a good reference to work together. With the time, in the process, in our grow as an office, we've discovered that what is interesting of that kind of construction is not the formal, the anonymous, the non-representative language of that kind of stuff, but the efficiency of that kind of buildings. How efficient are them? How efficient are that kind of construction to protect someone, to protect animals, to protect something? And through this way, we have understood that this is only possible in terms to understand the behavior of the building, the behavior of the matter that build that buildings. And if you understand that, you would understand that for us, during that lapse of time, we've moved from the right side of the image to the left side of the image, understanding that is as efficient as the right side, the left side building. So for us, we have understood that we are interested in efficiency more than in vernacular. What I will try to explain to you is different approach of the office to the idea of matter. Matter, and because we really believe that the basic aim of architecture is to reorganize materia, to reorganize the matter, which is the basic, is a big challenge, but at the same time is something difficult to transmit to the clients and to the students, that we are just there to reorganize something that is already there, which is the matter. In this line, in this idea, is the most basic idea in front of the matter, is that the matter is already there, as I've told, and so the preexistence is something that is matter of the project. To explain that, I will show you a house that we finished like a year and a half ago, not to explain the whole house, but just to explain a part of the process that is important, or for me is a good example about this approach in front of the material, to understand the matter as a behavior, as a group of performs. This is a house in a very beautiful town called Ullastret. It's a typical town in a place called Costa Brava in the north coast of Barcelona. Beautiful village, narrow streets, that kind of heritage that is more a thematic park than a real village, but is that. This is a beautiful village with an old part of the city with that kind of wall, dense urban fabric, with that kind of narrow streets that go from the center to the countryside. The case of the house is a beautiful, beautiful plot with an agricultural origin, with that kind of heritage in this case. We are not different, I suppose, that the rest of the architects, that we try to begin our projectual process trying to understand the reference of the context. And in this case, the reference was absolutely clear. It was that huge, beautiful wall that surrounds the plot, and that it was the main reference to begin the design process. So for us, it was a clear case that it should be a house that works linked, plugged to the wall, as large as the wall is, and just as is a weekend house. So we tried to develop a house, a very extreme house in terms of typology, because it's just a pure porch as large as the wall. This was a beautiful idea that became something like that. It was good for the client, it was good for us. But then, at this moment of the process, we went to the council. And the council gave us a very bad news. The news was that that street, it was supposed that it has to be changed because the street was too narrow for the cars. Okay? So the original geometry of the line, the original geometry of the wall, it has to be changed into the orange line. Okay? So it was terrible for us because it was so clear our relation with the heritage in terms of wall. What a beautiful wall, what a reference, what a... It makes me remember an explanation of Rudolf Schindler about what is architecture and how he explained that architecture for him was that sense to cross a threshold with a big wall in his back. So it was a little bit the same idea. So it was a big crisis for the office. But as we say in Spain, no hay mal que por bien no venga. When there's something bad at the end, there's something good. And in this case, that crisis means to understand what is really important in front of the matter, which is the behavior of the matter, not the memory. The memory, of course, is beautiful, is interesting, the heritage in terms of composition, but the first step is to understand what's the real behavior of the matter that you have in front. And from the point that it was impossible to maintain the wall in the same place, our decision was to demolish the wall and to rebuild again the wall, not just for memory, but understanding that the original stones were still able to work in a structural way. Okay, so the behavior of the matter was already there to be used again. So it's a clear case of to reorganize the matter. So our position in front of the preexistence is not a nostalgic position. It's a proposal position trying to understand how can perform the matter. In this case, so we decided to do, we did the research in terms of material and structure to develop a house with a structure, what we call a cyclopic concrete wall. Okay, it's a wall made with these big stones from the wall, from the original wall, that has no reinforcement inside. There's no steel bars inside, just work as a compression wall, just work thanks to these big stones, and it's just a one-wall house. That means that the wall assumes not only the structural role, but also the insulation role. One of these buckets is with glass insulated air that works into the mix as is not an incredible insulation, but it was the way to introduce into the structural part of the house, not only the structural perform, but also the insulation perform, and of course, the technique research. So we did such an old-fashioned wall like this, but at the same time, really extreme in terms of typology and in terms of performing. So we mix the lime with the soil of the place, with the big stones like this in layers of 10 centimeters, doing this typology, which is a clear porch house. It's a little bit extreme. It's a weekend house with there's no heating system, there's no climate system apart from the passive behavior of the whole house. And all the wall was so big that we got stones enough not only to do the wall, but also to do the inside walls and also to do the pavement of the garden. At the end of the process, we just had to take off just the thin layer of concrete that hides the stone to recover the color of the old stones. So I think for me it's a perfect example to explain. Of course, I have some examples about different positions in front of the preexistence, in front of the heritage. But for us, the first approach in front of any kind of matter, in any kind of presence, is to understand how it can roll. So the new wall with the geometry that the council decided is like this. You can see how the old geometry has disappeared and has moved. And on the other side, the house is just a full porch that faces to the south, that faces to the plot, is I have to say that it's incredibly beautiful. It's a perfect customer. I know that it's not always like this, but you have to imagine how bad new was the new from the council. So it's a little bit of balance between the perfect client and the perfect place with a high-level difficulty process. So the concrete inside is just with the concrete aspect. There's no process to shows up the stone inside, but the stone is there. Also the installations, which are like this, but part are hidden to the walls. And to get some level of privacy on that scheme that you've seen in the plan, we just curved, you say, to curve into the mass to get some little privacies for the beds, because it's such an extreme typology means that you have to cross bedrooms to arrive to your bedroom. But it's a weekend house, you can cross through the garden. But at the end, maybe thanks to our climate, it works also right in winter, because it's so well orientated that during the week they are in Barcelona. When they come back every Friday, the house is being closed in front of the sun during the whole week, so it's between 18 and 21 degrees in winter time, okay, thanks to the greenhouse effect of all this transparent facade to the south. But I don't want to, well, that's a good, by the moment, 1.5 years after, the customers are happy enough to invite us every year, well, twice, to have a meal there. So by the moment, the idea is working all right, okay? But it's not important. I just want to explain that first approach to the idea of matter. Technique is an objective matter, but at the same time is an abstract concept that for us is very important. What means technique for us? Technique is that idea to have to take from the common knowledge about how we have to build, and at the same time enlarge that idea of knowledge to the specific research that we do in every project and in every construction process. So it's to link the common knowledge with our specific research. And for us, but not all the techniques, not all the systems. We have to assume that we are just concerned about a specific kind of architecture. When we were interested at the beginning of our practice in that idea of popular and vernacular, we were just playing in a process of imitation to that kind of examples that surrounds us in our villages, okay? We understood later that the shape, the form of that kind of vernacular that we were attracted for, it was the result of a structural concept, which was the structural walls that work as a compression, just works in compression way, okay? Then, like 15 years ago, we visited that building. This is the famous it's not a vernacular example, it's not a popular building, it's not a popular construction, it's the Schinkel Pavilion in Charlottenburg, okay? But was walking through that cells, walking through that group of spaces, that we understood that the structural walls is not only an element, a structural behavior, is also a system that not only defines the structural part, but defines the geometry of the space. This is something so simple, but for us it was like a big discovery. There's a great professor in Barcelona called Ignacio Aparicio that wrote in an article about that idea to compare the two big families in construction. In one hand, we have the multi-layer systems. That means that we use specific products or specific matters for specific answers to the demands of the building, okay? On the other hand, we have that kind of construction where a structure and enclosure, a structure and geometry of the space is the same thing. Aparicio didn't say that one is better than the other. But he said that the multi-layer systems, that the specific layers never can be old. If get old, it doesn't work. When the facade of a new hospital or the facade of a skyscraper, a part of the facade doesn't work properly, the whole facade doesn't work. So it can become older. It's impossible. Always have to be new. Doesn't matter if it's 50 years, 100 years. On the other side, said Paricio, that kind of construction that identifies a structure with geometry of the space, he said something that it's something like in Spanish, can become old. Well, it's more beautiful how he said it. But for us, it's a beautiful concept. Of course, that it doesn't work as perfect. It's not able to answer to such a high number of demands as a super multi-layer facade. But in terms of time, never get broken. So for us, that idea, that kind of examples where a structure and space, conditions of the space is the same thing, is the kind of architecture that we are interested, that we are concerned, and that we are trying to do. I repeat, that is not the only way, is not the best example maybe, but is the one that it works for us, is our common place from the very beginning of our practice. So our process is about structural walls. And we've did a lot of examples of houses that from that idea of facade as a structural wall to the typology based on structural walls. Also to begin to understand that how also the inside comfort, it's defined by the conditions of the structural walls and so on and so on. But in this case, the interesting part of this case, it was that it was a research process that understanding that this is a house based, again, in a series of spaces defined by structural walls. In this case, we tried to understand, to do a research, to develop a little bit more the technique about the structural walls based on bricks, trying to make work that wall not only at compression, but also at flexion. This wall has no specific beams. The whole wall is reinforced to assume not only the heavy of the building, but also the effort in the horizontal parts. Okay, so all the aspect, all the shape is just showing the behavior of the structure into the wall. It's not just a composition based on construction. All the walls, well, you will see. But in terms of typology is also interesting, but just for one thing that I will explain as fast as possible. This is the typical plot that we have in Barcelona, small towns that surrounds the city, but not only close to Barcelona. In whole Catalonia, this is the kind of plots that we are dealing always. Narrow plots, quite large, that for an original typology, the classical typology, it works all right, but for the new kind of demands from the clients has a big problem. That is that kind of houses are too close to the street in terms of privacy, in terms of noise, in terms of other demands, became a problem, that kind of classical typology. What we did in this house was to introduce the idea of courtyard, of distance, of flexible space in between the street and the real house. But this is not just a garden, it's not just a courtyard, it works also as a greenhouse to introduce a passive climate in the between, okay? So this house is just a series of spaces defined by the structural walls. It's a concept here that is also very interesting for us, which is a concept explained by Jacques Zondelat, which was a little bit doing a big resume, which is something like to design a specific space, but not specialized spaces. So what we try to do is a series of spaces that are very specific, very unique, but not because of the function that allows, but because of the construction conditions. Very high, very low, very big, with a lot of texture, with cross ventilation, with sunlight, with so on and so on. not based in the idea of what kind of program can allow. Ondelat said something like, functionalism is against freedom of use. When you do something that functions pretty well, sometimes it's not easy to transform this space into other ways to use it. So a little bit our idea, and in this house is pretty clear, is that idea to produce very specific, not extravagant, but as unique as possible spaces, but because of the texture, because of the dimension, because of the geometries, and try to produce all that conditions through the structure. Okay? When you see that kind of walls, which the density of the bricks is changing, it's not changing just for a composition decision. It's changing because on a structural wall as it is, the brick is the heaviness of the building demands more effort to the bricks which are at the bottom than to the bricks that are at the top of the house. That's why the bricks in the bottom part are narrow. When the wall has to assume flexion efforts over the halls is when we place also, again, very narrow bricks, because we need to put that kind of very thin steel bars that makes that the whole wall work as a beam, and so on and so on. There's a lot of decisions based on the behavior of the wall that at the same time is giving texture, atmosphere to the space. And it's the same, we try also to introduce in this house into the slabs, also in a structural element, also the idea of comfort. Also so the conditions about the inside comfort is also placed in the structural parts of the house. So I think, for me at least, it's clear the relation between the Schinkel pavilion, where I don't know if you've been there, but you have that sense of the space giving conditions. And when you understand that that space is based in structural walls, then for us the link is pretty clear. But as I said, it's just that series of spaces and that kind of research trying to understand how the wall can be compression and flexion at the same time. We have done just a path from one street to the other. Energy is matter, of course. It's a thermodynamical base. No? It's a topic of thermodynamics, so it's maybe the most obvious approach to the idea of matter, that energy is matter, and matter is energy. And what we've done it was a little bit introduced in the house before. We have understood that buildings has two elemental parts, and a structural part that is there to support the activity of living, the activity of people, to support that, and the enclosure, the envelopment part that is there to protect the activity of living. Those two parts are in all the buildings. It's an elemental part of construction and of architecture. What we tried, and what we keep on trying, is ask to these elemental parts, structure and envelopment and protection, to perform in as maximum number of roles as possible. Not only to be structure, but also to be acoustic design. Not only to be structure, but also to be the geometry of the space. Not only to be structure, but also to be the system that gives climate conditions to the space. The same with the skin of the building, not only to be the rainproof layer, but also, in this case that we're going to see, to be also an insulation system that gets gains from the sun, or that produce ventilation, and so on and so on. Then, in our opinion, the elemental parts of the building, if you ask to do as much as roles as possible, then become fundamental in the idea of architecture. To show that, I'll show you this building. Is a research center in the Autonomous University of Barcelona. It's another characteristic of all the stuff that I'm showing. This is 5 minutes from my home and 5 minutes from my office. So Another way to explain our stuff, our production, is to see what's the distance between the building and the office. And in general, I think that we have nothing that is 1.5 hours from the office by car. And this is just 5 minutes. We are not special, well, we are proud of that, because we have to assume that we are not plenty of commissions, that we are not plenty of money, because we have assumed that the only way to get certain results is to be as close as possible, not only to the building process, but also to the agents that are involved in the building process, to the people, to understand what is that complex process about. Well, that research building is basically an idea about how to manage with energy. By the basic idea that this building was a research about how many climates are into a building. We assume in general that a building, we identify the buildings with one kind of climate, because we base the idea that just thanks to the skin, thanks to the inside systems, we produce a standard climate position in front of what is happening outside. And in general, it's always like this. What we tried in this building is to do a division, at least between two kinds of climates. The production spaces climate, this is a research building with offices, with some classroom, but it's not important, that part. But at the same time, we decided that it's going to be very important in this building to have as maximum as possible of non-programmed spaces. Because in the research buildings nowadays, it's pretty important, that kind of spaces, because it's where the researchers that are absolutely concerned about what they are researching and so on, they have discovered that by organizing tea times, by organizing breakfast all together and so on, suddenly in that meetings is where new lines of research shows up, and for that kind of centers, this is pretty important. So from that idea, we decided to put as minimum as programmed space as possible, and to introduce into the design as maximum as possible of non-programmed space, of intermediate space, of huge, let's say, corridors that are for nothing, but are really useful at the end, because happens what is unexpected. So these two kind of climates, we assume that we have tried and we have succeeded to at least that intermediate space, the non-programmed space, is completely passive. It works by itself. What it means? It works is in acceptable conditions thanks to the nature of the building. That means geometry and matter. Because of the inertia, because of the geometry, because of the cross ventilation, because of the kind of facade, does in its nature produce internal conditions. It's not thanks to a machine. Okay? It's not possible in the inside offices that have to assume specific standards of climatization, so it's the two kind of climates. At the end, we discovered that it was not two climates. It was at least 6 different kind of climates into the building, and we've dealt with that with a basic strategy. This is, at the end, a building that in fact is a greenhouse, a real greenhouse, is a standard greenhouse made by catalog, built by a company that builds greenhouses, with a concrete structure inside with a lot of inertia. That combination between the greenhouse working as a greenhouse in winter and working as a shadow system with a lot of ventilation in summer, also with the inertia, and trying to control with CFD simulation how the air gonna move into the building, that we have get into that kind of diagrams that the intermediate space moves from the intermediate space without inertia moves here, and with the inertia, just with the natural behavior of the inertia, you get into the 20-26 degrees. So the two parts, the two elemental parts are in one side the structure. Well, here you have the intermediate space, the offices. But you have in one side that heavy structure, that we were interested in that idea of heaviness, not because of the beautiful of the concrete, but because that amount of inertia was basic to stabilize, to give well, you know the concept of inertia. Well, at least for us in Barcelona, it's very clear to understand how important is the inertia as a possible passive strategy. What means inertia? When we live in Barcelona, we are close to the sea. That means that in Barcelona, the temperatures always are between, it's softer than the same moment 100 kilometers inside of the land, because the sea works as a big inertia that gets the excess of heat in summer and it gives it back to you in winter. So that's the inertia concept. So it's simple, it's clear, and is really famous that in Granada it's full of houses that works by itself into caves, into original caves. Why? Because you have the inertia of the mountain over your head, and you move between 17 and 25 degrees the whole year in Granada with a very extreme weather. Okay, so in the same sense, in the same idea, like a cave or like the sea, we try to put a lot of inertia into the building to stabilize, to make the temperatures range softer. So, but it's not the only thing that the structure assumes. It's not only the inertia, it's also the ventilation system of the building. It's that pipes that cross the structure. It's not only that, because it's also the system of the acoustics. The precast of the slabs have that texture to help a little bit in the acoustic comfort, and so on. So it's that idea that I was trying to explain, to ask the structure to have more roles than not only the support role. On the other hand, well, also the active systems are into the slabs, and so the slab became something very complex with a post-tense system and so on. And on the other hand, the skin, and a skin that is able to be closed in winter and to be open in summer, assuming shadow roles and also insulation role that moves and mutates, change in front of the outdoor, inside conditions. The skin is moving, trying to produce comfort conditions, and also not only conditions for human living, but also for vegetation living. Another way to understand the preexistence matter, what is already there, or that idea that matter is that architecture is about to reorganize matter, is to understand that is a type of already there material which we call product. A product, a brick, a timber panel, a CLT panel, is a product that is before our projectual process. So in the same way, we try to understand what are the specific behavior of that product as a way to develop our design process. So what here, well, it's an example about, it's not exactly the same, but that idea to deal with the catalog architecture. We did that students' residence, which is a complex situation, because it's a residence for, we teach in the same school where we studied in the 90s, and we won the competition for the students' residence. That means a competition where all the colleagues into the school were interested to win. So it's a complex process in terms of getting enemies during your life, because not only the colleagues, but also the students that then you meet at the classroom, and maybe they are called because of our design. It's not the case, so we are happy to say that we have no more enemies now than 10 years ago. But this competition is an interesting process, because the architectural process, the architectural competition was after a previous competition to decide who's gonna manage the building. Okay? This is something very European for the Spanish people, because in general we don't do that kind of well-think process. So we are more like straight on. So, but in this case, the wisdom of the architectural school was to decide before, okay, we are not professionals on the management of residents, so let's decide who's gonna manage this business, and then with their conditions, we're gonna do the architectural competition with the conditions of the manager. I think it's pretty smart. The only problem is that that happened at the beginning of the economic crisis. So the business, the companies who present to the management competition was not professionals on residential management, were constructors that were out of commissions, so they present to the competition. So the one who won the competition for the management was not a professional of management, was a professional of construction who was specialized on building this. So the main condition for the architectural competition was that we have to manage with this product, which is, because we can talk, a brick is a product, of course, but this is a clear product. So, and it was not our idea. It was not our decision to work with this. It was part of the conditions of the competition. We assumed that we won the competition for several reasons, but the important and the interesting part of the design process was to understand the positive parts of the geometry of the matter and to give a value to that, because you have to imagine that the builder who produced that was absolutely ashamed about its own product. For him, this is just a skeleton. This is just a frame to place plasterboard, plaster, cardboards, furnitures, curtains, to hide the concrete, okay? And this was necessary because the concrete was not enough in terms, for example, of fire protection. It was too thin. In terms of acoustic, also was a little bit, it needs something else. So our process in terms of design, and this is the interesting part to me to explain that idea of product, also to understand again which are the attributes of the matter, was to see how to make it better, to let it as it looks. Okay, so we were working, we worked with the engineers of the company to see how put another steel bar that assumes in case of fire that the structure can be non-protected, or to make more insulation between the system to be in conditions for the acoustics insulation, and so on. Just to see that the good part of the product was the concrete aspect, and the geometry, and the heaviness, and the inertia. So at the end, well, this is the interesting part. Of course, it's also interesting to do that kind, but we're absolutely against about that idea of three-dimensional prefabricated systems, because that means that you're moving air from the factory to the site of the building. You're moving air. This is absolutely expensive. Is unacceptable in terms of sustainability. It's far more efficient to move two-dimensional pieces and to put it together on the site, okay? But it was not our decision, okay? Well, apart of that, our relation with the product, the other interesting ideas of this competition was what is known as that idea of urban metabolism, to understand that it's not the challenge in terms of sustainability is not only in the specific building. The challenge of the sustainability is to understand that we are in a context, and that we have to understand what are the excess of production of our neighbor, or the demands that we have. I mean, that we have to be sustainable, but maybe asking to our neighbors to let us something, and to give us, to our neighbors, what is an excess for us. What I mean is that one of the reasons that we won the competition was, for example, to make them understand that we were in front of a huge building, which is the architectural school, and that just by schedule, when the students are in the building, they are not in the residence, and the opposite. That means that it's not necessary to have two heating systems. So our proposal was to use the heating system of the architectural school to give heat conditions to the residents. Our proposal was to don't place any kind of studios into the residents as the competition asked for, because there were lots of studios in the school. To don't place any kind of coffee bars into the residents, because it was a bar into the school. So we won the competition because we were the team with larger number of rooms in front of the rest of the teams, that they were assuming the conditions of the competition in terms of studios, coffee shops, and so on. And also with water. We are close to a building with a huge roof that can get a lot of rainwater, and the water is using for the gardenery of the residents. Well, the section is not interesting. At the end is a building, is a very dry, austere building that show the behavior of the product, but it's just a support, not only for the human living again, also for the vegetation and for the greenery, not only in the garden inside, but also in the bedrooms, because they are architectural students. So what we propose from the very beginning of the competition is that the company can not only rent the space, but they can also rent a specific kind of furniture that we designed, so we can get a double rent from the students. And it was a decision of the student how they decide to colonize the inside space, doing double bedrooms, just one space. So it was at the same time, as you've seen, we won because we were the best business for the managers. Okay? And it's like this, so we just get there, the product changing what you cannot see to let the product as could be seen, and then that kind of austere inside the space, it's geometrical, very well controlled, to assume a lot of different way of colonizations. The facade is a little bit the same, but in this case not with the students, but with the greenery. That building at the very beginning, when it was just finished, our students called that Guantanamo. You know Guantanamo? So it was the bad name for the building at the very beginning. Then in 1 year, they stopped to call like that because the greenery transformed the facades into a green, beautiful facades that are all time like this. The emptiness, the idea of void, is also a material, matter of project, matter itself. The demolition is a creative process. The erase of matter is also a design process. And it's not about, this case is not about to demolish what is not part of the heritage. It's to demolish, to get new attributes into the heritage. This is a very old building, well, not very old, but it's from the 20s, from the last century. It's an old workers' cooperative that we've transformed into a cultural center, civic center, a multi-purpose cultural center in a very dense neighborhood into Barcelona. It's called La Lleialtat Sancenca. And it's like this, beautiful. It's a lot of memory. Memory not only in terms of composition, also memory about the history of that kind of very specific typologies in Barcelona, which was the workers' cooperatives that succeed a lot at the beginning of the 20th century. Not for syndical reasons, but because in that times that was difficult to get to certain kind of products because the world was smaller. The workers come together to buy together, let's say, pig meat in other part of the country and so on. So the cooperatives were always two very specific parts: the storage, the shop, and the social spaces. So in general, they were always that two very clear parts: social places, commercial spaces. So we respect the facade because it was also a condition of the competition, but in the inside, the building inside was not catalogued, was not protected by the council, so we were free to demolish the whole building. What we decided by understanding the original project, because the building was closed for 15 years, and during the whole 20th century after the Civil War, it was from a sweets factory to a disco to another storage to a lot of different programs. So the original architecture were very blurred through the years, and we tried to get the original project to understand what are the structural parts of the building at the moment that we began the competition, and we saw that the original project was not specifically interesting. In fact, the architect never was at the plot because the street, it has a very serious slope, and in no plan the slope of the street is there. So it's not an incredible architecture example. In fact, it's not protected, it's not cataloged. But our approach is again to understand the attributes of the matter, and in this case, the attributes of the building. So what we decided is that not all the spaces were interesting in terms of behavior, but there were spaces that doesn't matter if the architecture quality was high, but in terms of program could work again with new programs. So we decided to demolish not the whole building, but just a part of the building that responds to a part of the original program, and that thanks to that decision, that demolition, that specific and very well-controlled demolition, we produced that idea of void, of emptiness, that in fact is not an emptiness, is a street. It's literally to put the street into the building, but not with the conditions of the outside space, but with the conditions of a new kind of a space that works in a very passive way, but gives new attributes to the whole building. So the new space, that new void, that street, gives, for example, a new attribute in terms of circulation. So the original way of circulation of the building disappears, and is a new way. That street is the space that gives a new structure to the circulation of the building. At the same time, is the space where all the inside and climate spaces put the dirty air, the CO2, because that part of the building, thanks to the roof that gains sun gains and works as a chimney, moves the whole air of the building. And at the same time, of course, that gives ventilation, gives sun gains, and at the end the building is like a two type of spaces. The original spaces that can be reorganized and that still have attributes enough to assume new programs, and that new kind of emptiness that have natural conditions, passive conditions, and also again that idea of unprogrammed spaces. So the new void, circulation, sun gain, ventilation, the roof works, is the only place where we get sun from the south, and this is the way that thanks to a greenhouse effect, that the whole movement of the air of the building goes up because of the heat of the roof. And on the other side, the original spaces of the cooperative that used to be storage or a multi-purpose space for socials, and now it becomes a theater because of the geometrical conditions or also the acoustic conditions or the natural light conditions, means that old space can assume new programs, new roles. And the last approach, our interest, not it's to explain that I always use that image, which is a diagram that my partner did for his PhD. This is a serious diagram. It looks so simple, but it has a very interesting idea inside. That diagram was done doing the calculation of the heavy of a house, 100 square meters house, doing an obvious division between the heavy of the solid part of the house, the heavy of the liquid part of the house. All houses has a liquid part in 2 pipes and so on, and the heavy of the air inside the house. Okay, so the proportion is more or less obvious if you do the calculation of the heaviness of a house. But if you do the same calculation, not for 1 instant, but for 1 year, the heavy of a house per year, introducing that idea, that concept, which is time, suddenly the proportion change absolutely. Because the heavy part, the solid part of the house, doesn't change in 1 year. But in 1 year, the liquid part of the house is renovated a lot of times, and of course that the air, the gaseous part of the house, change a lot. In this space that we are now, that the climate conditions is based in an HVAC system, you have to imagine that the air is renovated by between 9 and 11 times per hour. So then you would understand, maybe the diagram is a silly diagram, but at least show the importance, at least in terms of heavy, of the air, of that part of architecture that we don't see, but is the real interface between the conditions that produce our architecture and how we feel that conditions. Okay? So the 2 ideas that gave us that diagram was how important is the air and how important is the time. But this is because at the end, the time is what makes difference in a sculpture than a building. A building, living is impossible without time. So we have to introduce the time as matter of project. And we have to assume that air is matter. We have a clear idea, and we try to introduce always in our projects, and I want to share that with you as architects as you are. We really believe that during the last, it's obvious that we live in a society where the visual perception was the most important because it's the faster way of perception. In general, we watch architecture through pictures, not by reading or not by visiting. We watch the pictures of the new papers, we watch the pictures in the Instagram. So the visual perception is really fashion, and because it's the faster, but it's not the only one. It's true, it's obvious. The thing is that it hasn't been always like this. Our society, it's not been always based on that visual perception. In fact, and in the same time, in the same way, architecture during the last 75 years, with the development of the HVAC systems, with the machines to give climate conditions to the spaces, we have decided that there's something that we don't see, which is the air, that we are not interested on. As architects, during the last 75 years, we have decided that we don't want to talk about the air. And we have let the engineers to decide how to give conditions to the air. But this is not the only way to design, because if you see the vernacular examples, you will see how into the specific tools of architecture is possible to give comfort conditions to an inside space, isn't it? So what we are trying and what we are asking to everybody is, of course, that we need engineers. You will see now a project that is absolutely impossible to develop without the help of the engineers. But we have to do, but what we try to do is to find out engineers that assume that the solution won't be thanks to a machine that we place also, again, in a place that we don't see, in the roof, in the back facade, and so on, to find out the solution into something specific in architecture, geometry and matter. By designing geometry and matter, we have to be able to produce as maximum as comfort conditions as possible. Of course that at the end maybe you need some machines, some fans, but as I always say, thermodynamics never broken. but an HVAC system can get broken. So, and in this line, we did this building, which is an adult school in the center of Barcelona. It's a small facility for adult people, which is called Cristalleria Esplanell, that has that strange image in the roof. It was again a competition with two very bizarre and hard conditions. The presence of the triangular shape of the plot, difficult shape, difficult geometry to work with, and that two faces of the triangle were occupied by an heritage facade belonging to an old glass factory that used to be in that place of Barcelona. The factory was huge, but the development of the city decided that a new street will cross the plot, producing that very small, narrow, and difficult shape plot that would assume new facilities for the city. So the two conditions that is more or less described in the top diagram was the beginning of the design process, because assuming that an adult school will have a lot of classrooms, and it's like this, 70% of the program is classrooms, we decided that the classroom is going to be on the south face, in the south facade of the plot. But in the south facade, we have that heritage facade based on the dimensions of an industry. So very high roofs, 4 meters sizes, big halls on the top, small halls on the first floor. And that means that it was very difficult to get good natural light conditions inside the classrooms. So our first strategic decision was to do that 2 steps behind decision. That means to place a courtyard in between the building and the original facade. Okay? That courtyard not only makes the natural light more homogeneous, that at the same time gives you also new natural light from the ceiling. Okay? The second decision was to understand that this courtyard could be not only a courtyard, could be a greenhouse in winter and a garden in summer, working in different ways in terms to give a pre-treatment to the air before the air coming to the building. Okay? Then the building is very simple in terms of thermodynamic, because you have a natural heat system inside. You have 25 adults in each classroom producing heat. So the winter strategy is very simple, to make the building as close as possible in winter, controlling a lot the renovation system of the air, because it's through the renovation that you are losing the heat of the inside spaces. And in summer, absolutely the opposite. Doing as much as cross ventilation as possible, and these two strategies, again, with a lot of inertia, because the structural walls, this is a facility of 4 floors with the structural walls made of brick, okay? 25 centimeters walls every 4 meters, giving not only a structural role, but also, again, a climate role, helping with the inertia of the mass of the structure to this behavior, okay? The inertia needs always, especially in summer, it helps you during the day, keeping the excess of heat, but you need at night and during the whole day to do a lot of ventilation to dissipate that heat part that is in the inertia. So the ventilation system in this building is absolutely important. So the extra point in this building, you will see that the engine that moves the air into that average of 9 to 11 times per hour is a natural engine. It's not a fan, it's not an electric fan, it's that bizarre roof that you've seen in the first picture, is that sun chimneys that are dimensioned, that have the material, that have the kind of layers to produce a natural effect that moves 15 meters of air per hour, doing the whole renovation of the air during the summertime. But to talk about time, and about air, but also about time, means to talk about program. this facility is just a public facility. It's an adult school today, but the public programs change a lot. And we are doing a strategy based on inertia that means very heavy walls that is an heritage for the city that has to be there for a lot of years, is supposed. So what we try in terms of program is to do such a simple program, very well structured with a corridor in the middle and program both sides, doing that structural walls, but assuming that the large parts between walls has to be as flexible as possible, because maybe in the future that program will change. The good part of the triangular shapes is that the proportion in that building between classrooms and administrative part is very fixed, mixed very well with the triangular shape, because the 70% of the program is that part, the 30% of the program, which is the administrative part with the same structural size, fits all right in the north part of the building. So every wall that you see is again a structural wall, is a series of walls with no structural walls on the other direction, assuming that idea of flexibility that you can cross from one side to the other, arriving to the classrooms, where you find out that relation with the old facade through that courtyard. To talk about time, of course, is to talk about memory again. But again, in this case, and here is memory in terms of composition. But first of all, what we did in the project was to understand how able was the original wall to work as a wall. The heritage facade works in the new building, working structurally, assuming the heavy of the new facade, which is in the top. Okay? Not only giving us inertia and helping the climate conditions through the courtyard, not only helping to the natural light through the halls, also helping in terms of a structural role, assuming the heavy of the facade. And of course, it's memory, and for us, it was a nice decision to make work in terms of a structure, the new building, as the old building used to work. The old factory, of course, worked with the structural walls made of stone, with no steel bars, with no reinforcement, and so on. So not only the facade, also the greenhouse stands up over the old facade. The wall really is a greenhouse made with structural walls that work as a structural wall. That means that is done with glass bricks, and the bricks work as a regular brick, standing up over and transmitting the heavy over the old facade. Here you can see that idea that I explained at the beginning, the courtyard that has become a greenhouse, and in summertime all that halls get open, also the ceiling get open to work as a garden. But the interesting part of the building is the roof. Those are 4 sun chimneys, which are a very simple invention. You can find out a lot of interesting videos in YouTube about how to do a sun chimney for your son. You don't have sons, but I have. So I've done that kind of very easy sun chimneys with a plastic bottle. You just cut like this, you put a globus, and if you put in the sun, just because of the heat, the air goes up, right, and the globus pump up, and so on. So this is a sun chimney. It's a physical invention. It's nothing new. But it's an incredible engine. In fact, the new electric power stations in the desert is based in the sun chimney effect. Okay, so this building has active systems, but the basic idea in terms of behavior is what I've been talking about: inertia and cross ventilation. Okay, but the plus of the building is to produce that cross ventilation with a natural engine, which is that part. So the building works like this. The natural air goes from outside, because I mean, the ventilation is pretty important in that kind of strategies based on inertia, because you have to dissipate the excess of heat. So the air comes from outside, goes through the basement, goes into the courtyard like getting the freshness of the soil, come into the courtyard, and then the windows open, the air crosses the classrooms, and the air goes up because of the sun chimney. The sun chimney asks the air to because the greenhouse effect of the chimney. Because the sun chimney in this case is based in 3 natural engines. On one side, the greenhouse effect. There are 2 layers, a black layer and a transparent layer. So the black layer in summertime, not in winter, but in summertime, coming to 90 degrees. At the midday, 90 degrees mean that the air that is between the 2 layers, between the transparent and the black layer, get a lot of energy of heat and goes up very fast. That air that moves has to be substituted. It needs a substitution that comes from the air from the classrooms. Okay? So the first engine is the sun chimney effect based in a greenhouse effect. The second natural effect is what we call chimney effect, is the difference of pressures between the air which is in the top of the vertical part of the chimney and the air which is into the classroom. The difference of highness means also a small difference of pressures, and that means, again, a movement up of the air. And the third natural effect is the Venturi effect, which is into the hat, into the top of the whole invention, which is, again, a catalog invention. This is called Aerospirato. It's into a catalog. You can buy it. You can see it in a lot of industrial roofs. It's very common, and it's not expensive. We need that third invention. We need that third natural effect, because the sun chimney not only has to work during the day, thanks to the sun energy, but also at night needs a minimum of renovation to take off the excess of heat of the inertial walls. So those 3, and this is what is about what we understand that we need in terms of engineering. We need engineering in terms of simulation, of parametrization, of objective analysis of how it's gonna perform. But we don't need engineers just to show us how efficient is a machine that's gonna get broken in 5 years, or 10 years, or 15 years. We've just done a competition for the La Sede, the place of the Architectural Association in Girona, next to Barcelona, just because the huge machine that they were so proud about, because they were the first one to place that huge kind of American machines that came from the States in the early 70s, finally, it's absolutely old-fashioned, finally it has broken, finally they have discovered that the waste of energy is incredible, and as now the Architectural Association in Spain is poor, is not rich anymore, they have decided that they have to do a competition, architectural competition, just to change the machine. Because the machines, at the end, and if you have a car, you know it, that at the end, all the machines get broken. But it doesn't mean that we don't need engineers. Okay. This is the south courtyard, and this is the north courtyard. It works absolutely the same as that origin of the air that is pre-treated in a natural conditions before it comes into the classrooms. The whole buildings, in this case, this building is interesting to us because, again, through the structure, we give conditions through the air. So the air, very close to the structure, always doing that path, touching the structure, is getting conditions of pretreatment, thanks to the inertia, but at the same time, is getting out the excess of heat, thanks to the renovation. And I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Oh, thanks so much for this extraordinary presentation. I have to say it's very rare, too rare, that architects present their work, their projects with such a, putting forward such a strong conceptual framework. And thank you also for that, because there's a lot, I think, to discuss from all this. Before passing the microphone to the crowd, which is impatient, I'm sure, to ask questions, I would like to ask you one to sort of start the questions. In the end, what you showed us and what you explained, based on a number of words and concepts like energy, void, gravity, which is fairly everywhere, a condition for everywhere on the planet. And at the same time, you insisted on the fact that you were working very locally, and you were very proud to have your building sites not further than an hour and a half by car. So how do you see this tension between the kind of universality, in a way, of your claims to architecture versus, or in parallel to those of a form of regionalism or locality, at least?
Well, what I've explained doesn't mean that we just understand thermodynamics in our surrounding. Of course, that this approach is, for me, is global. It's not the only way. I mean, I hate to look like if I'm like saying the only true in architecture. Mm-hmm. So it's just our certains. We are certain about that. But in our situation, what I mean is that, of course, that some strategies that we have to assume as architects, in general, in the whole world, that we have to assume to recover for our responsibilities that idea that we have, through architectural conditions, to give comfort conditions. This is absolutely global. I think that is an aim and is a challenge for the whole architectural community in all around the world. For me, it's absolutely clear. Because I always explain the same. We have to remember that before the economic crisis, I know maybe in Paris for you the economic crisis, I know that you know what is the economic crisis, but you have to have the clear idea that in Spain and in Catalonia the economic crisis was absolutely amazing, was terrible.
Devastating.
Was terrible. So, but the economic crisis has hidden that before the economic crisis, I'm talking about 12 years ago, we were talking, of course, and 20 years ago, about a climate crisis and a resources crisis. We are into a general resources crisis. So for us, that position, in terms of recover for architecture, the responsibility to give comfort conditions through architectural tools, is absolutely global. But the fact is that for us, it's far more important in architecture the attitude than the attitude, the position, the personal position, than the talent. And I think that we are not talented enough to convince people 2 hours by plane to do the same that I can do to someone who is living close to me, who is my neighbor, who I understand more or less how the business and the construction process is something very specific of every region. And this is something we're talking about business. The construction business in Catalonia, not in Spain, in Catalonia is absolutely specific. In fact, our history, our biography is only possible to be understood in Barcelona in the 90s, in the end 90s and beginning of the 2000s, where any architect that shows out from the school was able to get a commission for a small house. And it was like this. So we were able to build at the very beginning of our office, to build small things with people with low budgets but high level of confidence in us. And this is something so local, so specific of our biography that right now, 20 years after the beginning of the office, we are still arguing in the office if we do competitions abroad. Because if we won, what would happen? So we did one in Perpignan, because it's the North Catalonia. And it's like 2 hours by car. It's a little bit, and we lose, so we don't know.
That's France.
But I think that it's global, obviously. Well, thermodynamics, I mean, And of course, that architects, we are specialists in what we do. We are researchers of what we design. So we explain, we have expertise in what we have experienced. And I'm absolutely sure that the ICTA Center, the one with the greenhouse, it was a risky building because a greenhouse in Barcelona conditions is a risk. But it works as a shadow in summer and so on and so on. I wouldn't assume that risk working in Paris because I don't have a clear idea. It doesn't matter the engineers, it doesn't matter the personal experience. So I think that it can be translated, it can be exported, but not for us, not by us.
Glenn Murcutt says the same.
Se me hace raro preguntarte en inglés, pero creo que voy a hacer el esfuerzo. Oh, no, estaba ya lié. I think when you were dealing with energies matter, techniques matter, existences matter, I would say also structure is matter. And you were talking about the engineers. I think we should point out that in Spain, it's a very specific kind of practice where architects are fully responsible for the project. I mean, engineering firms are over there to do the calculations, they're drawing plans, documents, but they are never responsible for all that amount of information. So that means that you're 100% responsible for what you're doing. So that's lots of responsibility, but also lots of freedom. How do you manage so much freedom, which in the end helps you to do experiments like those because you're the one who's signing the project?
Well, and because it's a research process with a terrible law. It's called gravity. So, I mean, of course that it gives you a lot of freedom, and we want that freedom. We are absolutely, well, in fact, I've been talking all the time about the structures. I haven't talking hardly about anything else. So I've talked basically about the structures, but we not only design the structures just to assume support, but also to assume as maximum as conditions for the space as possible. So of course that we need that tool for the design of our buildings. Not everybody are interested in that, and it's not necessary to be interested in that. But for us, is a power tool, okay? But in terms of responsibility, Spain has some specificities. We are the only responsible for everything, and we can ask to the engineers to assume that, well, you have to imagine that the best structural engineer in Barcelona is an architect, is not an engineer. Is Boma, is Robert Brufau, has office in London, New York, Barcelona, and they are architects. All the people into that office, they are all architects. And some, well, in fact, the ICTA building is a structure from Brufau office. And there's another point. For small houses, I mean, also me, with my basic knowledge in structures, I'm able to do the calculation of the walls and the slabs. So, in fact, the office, at the very beginning, we tried to did all the structures into the office as possible. Just when the building began to be a little bit bigger, and not because of the legal responsibility, because at the end it's for me again, but because of the complexity of the softwares to do the calculation, that we don't have this at the office, we began to work with that kind of consultancy. But I mean, it's like to talk about comfort. For me, it's impossible to understand the idea of architecture without introducing from the very beginning the idea of the structural behavior of the building. I mean, it doesn't matter if the final calculation of the sun chimney is from an engineer, but the concept is from the office. So at least we have to conceptualize the performance of the structure. Then you can find out the best consultant possible. But we have to introduce that concept into the design, as the matter behavior, as everything. But for me, it's difficult to imagine the opposite. Then, if there's no structure, there's no structural perform, then there's no time, then there's no air, then there's no nothing. Because at the end, it's the easiest way to transform architecture into sculpture. An object that is not important how it performs, because there's no time in a sculpture. And for me, the first step into the idea of perform, into the idea of time, is the perform of the elemental part of the building, which is the structure. I don't know if it's a good answer.
Qui?
Okay. Thanks for the presentation. I have a question. Your work, there's a lot of research, I would say, in every project that you presented. How does that work in your office? How is it financed? Is the client, or do you have the time? Or basically, architecture is always so you have to produce very fast and
No,
I would like to
as you've seen, of course, that there's to win a competition, it gives you the chance, at least, that at the very beginning of the real design process, you are in a strong position because you've won a competition, and it's gonna be done what you've more or less designed thanks to the competition process. So from that point of view, in a competition, maybe you have the chance, because what you have said, it has to be done, to convince easily a client that a research process is necessary. But, for example, in this last example, we convinced the client, the city council, to get the LEED certification. It was a green marketing interesting for the council. So thanks to the money that they were able to put in the process to get the LEED certification, we used that money to pay the engineers to do the simulations. Okay? So, but it was not about to convince them to do a sun chimney. It was, I mean, for me, the design process is only understandable as a research process. So it's always a research. It doesn't matter if it's a research in terms of typology, in terms of programmation, in terms of memory. In our case, our basic research is in thermodynamics. And it, as I explained, is not always the same. But when you're talking with so when the client is not the one who's gonna live there, it's more or less, so a competition, a facility, maybe, and the budgets are bigger, you feel more comfortable, you have more chances to introduce a specific research process into the design process. But when you are with a private client, who in general is a friend, because only a friend assumes a weekend house without corridors, without heating system, and so on, then it's not about to convince him. It's about, from the very beginning, that they have to assume an incredible level of confidence in us. Then we assume that we lost money, because of course, that we need like 3,000 hours, 3,000 office hours to do a small house. This is absolutely, in terms of business, you cannot imagine in the Barcelona scale how ruinous is.
Ruinous.
Okay? But we assume that. But the client have to assume a complete confidence in our decisions. That's why I always say that attitude is far more important than talent. Because when you convince a client about that, it's not because of your talent. It's because of your how strong you are in your faith. Sounds horrible, but you know what I mean.
D'autres remarques, questions? Pendant qu'on l'a sous la main, allez-y.
Yeah, you mentioned in the beginning of the lecture that you're working in a group of 4 people, and when in terms of a collaboration, you said it's like the personality. It's not a game, not the aim to express the personality of individuals, but more about you're trying to focus on efficiency about the project. Can you elaborate more about like this collaboration mode?
It was that idea of what, I don't know, because the translation maybe it's strange, but in Spanish, the idea of common place is something very well known. No? Lugar común. Something, it's not a geographical concept. It's an intellectual concept about something that can be shared. Well, you have to understand that before to be a professional team, we used to be friends. This is something important. And 25 years later, now is that because we met each other at the beginning of the career, let's say at the 92. So, long time ago, from 92, we became before friends, and then, but we were really fetishist. Yeah, we were fetishist in terms that at the very beginning of our studies, we discovered, thanks to El Croquis magazine, watching to the biography of Frank Gehry, we discovered something that maybe nowadays is very common, but we discovered that there were students' competitions. But when we were students, no one told us that there were students' competitions. But watching at the Gehry biography, it was a date. He won a competition, but it was impossible because he was at the university, at the college. So we discovered that concept of the students' competition. And we began to work together doing students' competitions, not only the studio projects and so on. So it's obvious that because we've worked together a lot of time, we are friends, so we work like this. But what is for sure, and is obvious in our architecture, there is that feeling of non-representative language. Maybe it's a construction language. I'm not saying that there's no language in what we do, but it's not a linguistic language. It's not an intellectual language. It's not a compositional language. So, because I really believe that compositional decisions only can be taken by one people, by one person. And in our case, it's been and I have to say that it sounds very boring, and it's boring. Our life is absolutely boring because we just talk about construction, heavy installation, pipes, and thermodynamics and temperatures. And we try, of course, that we take at the end some aesthetic decisions. There are aesthetic decisions. I'm not saying that. But there's no linguistic strategies. There's no intellectual strategies just in terms of abstraction. We always say something that I don't always, again, I don't know how to translate it. We hate to say como. This is something like. We never say that. And in fact, I have to say that in this way, I'm a dictatorship with my students. I not prohibit, but something like, I forbidden to say, to present the project saying sentences like, this is something like the snow. This is something like a nube, like a cloud. This is something that I listen to. This is a wall that helps you. Yesterday, a student told me, this is the two buildings touching together, touching one to each other. No, the buildings doesn't move. The architecture wants nothing. You want nothing. Architects want nothing. Because we are not artists. We are not doing our object, our desire. We have a public responsibility. We are doing politics. Through our architecture, we are doing politics. We are designing, we are doing proposals about social behavior. This is really important. This can be argued. This is pretty interesting to be argued in the office. But we are not doing clouds. We are not doing snow. We are not doing walls that walk. But have you listened to that? I'm sure that you've listened to that. This is something like, this is a wall like, this house is like. No, it's not like nothing. This is a house, this is a wall, this is and so on and so on. So, as I'm talking now, it's how we talk at the office. And we try, and I'm saying again, it sounds boring and it's boring. Because we are like Amish. Spanish people, you think that we are like extravagant and we love party, but Catalan people, we are a little bit different, and specifically me and my friends, we are like monks. But it's like this, we are absolutely boring. We are monks, we auto-obligate to don't talk about things that are that I loved in other buildings. I've been visiting Lebaron's church last year. It's one of my best experiences, but we are not able to take that kind of decisions. Some decisions of Lebanon's we can, and we love and we try to imitate him. But there's some decisions in San Marcos that it's only the discourse of a specific mind. And we are not like this because we are for minds. So we prefer to talk about politics than about language or linguistics or compositions, and we never use the like in a sentence. Try to do it. No, it's difficult.
This is a question about how do you stay motivated even when you have been working with projects that show you many, many limitations. For example, the house with the wall that had to be removed. For example, like the building, that it was an old industry and it was like heritage, but at the same time it had like climate problems, but you managed some way to
because as we are not able to talk about linguistics, about references, we don't use reference in the office. So if you don't have that, we have nothing to talk about. Thanks to the problems, we have something to deal with. And in fact, I have to say that we are like monks, but we are really optimistic. Because of the experience shown us that if that idea of attitude, it's easier to have attitude in front of the client, in front of the council, if you are for. This is an advantage to be for. It's true, because when you come back, because you prefer to annoy the guy from the council, than come back to the office, watch to your partners and say, we didn't succeed about the wall or about the... So if you are for, and you have to watch to your partner's face, that he becomes really angry because you haven't succeeded in something that is based in your strongness, in your strength in front of the difficulties, then to be for, it's a good part of the team. But I have to say that in general, because of the experience, it's true what I said at the beginning, that no hay mal que por bien no venga. When there's a bad part, there's always the opposite, like Monty Python's song. So look at the bright side, and there's always a bright side. So as you've seen, the big difficult has become a beautiful strategy, not only a smart strategy. It's also about sensibility, it's also about skin, it's also about feeling. I think that is far better, that project, thanks to the difficulties, the problems, that has asked us for a much effort to find out a new solution. So problems are basic part of the process.
Les vertus de la difficulté, on finit là-dessus? Ou encore une question? So we'll stop there. Thank you again, Josep, for this wonderful moment with you.
Thank you.
Et donc je vous donne rendez-vous la semaine prochaine pour la 3e conférence avec Georges Descombes, paysagiste, et tout de suite peut-être pour continuer la discussion, qui n'est pas forcément facile en anglais, autour d'un verre à l'extérieur. Merci.